Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the St. Joseph's University Unlimited Learning Expert Webinar Series. I am Meg Kavanagh from the class of 2016 and I will be your host today. I am joined today by our experts, Jill Bodensteiner and Maisha Kelly. Jill is the athletics director at St. Joseph's and Maisha is the athletic director at Drexel University. Maisha is also a graduate of St. Joe's where she was an outstanding track and field student athlete. On behalf of the St. Joe's alumni, congratulations on your new role, Maisha. We are incredibly proud of you and wishing you the best of luck at Drexel.
Thank you so much, Meg. Thrilled to be here.
I want to thank St. Joseph's University for coordinating today's event and thank you all for taking time out of your day to attend. The key element of the St. Joseph's University mission is the commitment to lifelong learning. That mission led to the creation of the Unlimited Learning Series and today's interactive discussion on the future of college athletics. I am sure that many of you tuned in today because you are fans of college sports. But in fact, before we jump into our main content, to further frame our conversation, we welcome attendees to take part in our first anonymous poll question that will pop up on your screen momentarily. Additionally, I want to send a thank you to all of our attendees who submitted questions during registration. We will address some of your questions later in the hour. If you have any questions during the course of the webinar, please feel free to place it in the Q&A feature below on your screen. All we ask is that you please include your name, location, and graduation year if you are an alum. At this time, I'd like to introduce St. Joseph's University Stacey Pagano, who will also be assisting behind the scenes with poll questions and the live Q&A session. Okay, let's see. Looks like our first poll results are in and most people responded that they are fans of college athletics. Exciting to see. And welcome to the former athletes as well as the parents of current and former student athletes. So before we dig into before we dig into the impact of name, image, and likeness, I am going to ask that our experts provide our attendees with some context. It seems like each week there is breaking off the field news about changes in college sports. So what is going on?
Hey, hi, thanks, Meg. I'll start with that. And pleasure to be especially here with Maisha. Again, congratulations, Maisha, on your new role. We're extremely excited. I'm extremely excited to have you as a colleague and peer here in town. So Meg, you are absolutely right. It is a bonkers time in college sports. That's a legal term. And so we're going to try and make this as concise as possible, also noting that, we're in the midst of multiple legal uncertainties. So there are some things I'm going to have to remain, Maisha and I will have to remain factual and hold off on our opinions as to not get us in too much trouble. But, here's sort of what the deal is the NCAA was originally founded to protect the health and safety of student athletes. That's how it started in the 1900s. It morphed, and additional critical principles for the NCAA included competitive equity, and probably the cornerstone, what became the cornerstone of college athletics is the notion of amateurism. So we are not professional athletes, we are amateurs. And so the long and the short of it is to protect those important principles, whether it's health and safety, competitive equity, and amateurism, the NCAA members pass rules. A lot of times people say, well, that's a silly rule, that's silly NCAA. Well, we pass the rules as members. So there are 359 Division I schools, and collectively we vote on the rule book that has become 400 pages, Maisha, over the years. And so what has happened in the past 5 to 7 years is that notion of amateurism has been challenged. And let's start with the why. The why is in large part, I think, a couple reasons. One, the revenue generated by college sports. And so whether it's through media deals, ticket sales, corporate sponsorships, et cetera, at the highest end of college sports, there's significant revenue being generated. There's significant salaries being paid to coaches. And so that's led to a bit of a narrative that the student athletes should get a share. There should be some kind of revenue share, or they should be something other than, in essence, amateurs. And so A quick side note, one of the things you never hear is that the NCAA is exploiting hockey and baseball athletes. So I do think it's worth recognizing that the NFL and NBA have put college sports in a little bit of a difficult spot. The owners and the players in those two leagues have collectively bargained to keep athletes out of their leagues until they attend college for a certain length of time. So the one and done rule, as it's so called, is not an NCAA rule. That's an NBA union agreement. So anyway, we've got this, the revenue, the narrative of student athletes being exploited. We've got student athletes with an incredible voice and a platform now through social media. They are essentially their own content producers with their own platform, which has been fun. Particularly saw it used very effectively with racial injustice matters in the past year or two. And then finally, you had the involvement of state and federal government, and really all three branches of the federal government. So all of that has sort of coalesced to put us in a situation where college athletics is at the biggest all-time crossroads in its history, without a doubt. And so, what do those challenges to amateurism look like? They look like antitrust after antitrust lawsuit against the NCAA and its member institutions. The most recent antitrust lawsuit made it to the Supreme Court. And so, that was a big moment in college athletics, because the Supreme Court essentially said, NCAA, you are subject to antitrust. And so I think that's one of the reasons that the NCAA members have realized our current state of affairs is not tenable. And Maisha is going to touch a little bit on what we foresee or what we know is happening at the NCAA level in the coming months. Second thing we've had as a challenge to amateurism, and again, I think this is exciting, is the NCAA lifting its rules that had previously prevented student athletes from entering the NIL marketplace. And then a third challenge to the concept of amateurism is, should student athletes be employees? And that's been challenged via various litigation over the past few years, and most recently in the last few weeks, the General Counsel of the National Labor Relations Board issued an opinion saying that we believe athletes should be deemed employees for purposes of the federal law, National Labor Relations Act, which governs employees' rights to collectively bargain and unionize. So there's a lot going on, and I'm going to turn it over to Maisha just to talk a little bit about what's happening at the NCAA as a reaction to many of the things I just talked about.
Great. Thanks, Jill. And thank you again. I'm proud to be back in Philadelphia. And as a wise coach once said, by the company keeps, I'm really extremely proud to be amongst Hawks and to have you as a colleague, Jill. So much of what Jill shared is, the NCAA as an association, we really are at an inflection point. It's the continuous litigation around antitrust. It's not sustainable. And it also suggests the way we're operating needs to be rethought and restructured even perhaps. And so the broad spectrum of members that exist in the association, even Division I, it really does represent that there are things that we need to figure out largely as an association. What kind of role might the NCAA play as we evolve in intercollegiate athletics? And so all three divisions meeting, and under Dr. Emmert, Mark Emmert, from the president of the NCAA, has said this is not just about minimal changes that we've perhaps have done throughout the years. This is really a look into a wholesale transformation of the NCAA as an association. And so Constitutional Committee has been formed, and that's representatives from all three divisions, chaired by Robert M. Gates, who's the former U.S. Secretary of Defense, as well as a former president of Texas A&M. And so it's really looking at what are the goals of each division, and so therefore framing Constitution in that way, and determining what would the student athlete experience look like across each division. And then also the presence of the NCAA. What kind of support might the NCAA as a body provide for? And there's a very aggressive timeline, which is happening. We are living in it. In November 15th, we'll see the recommendations coming out of the Constitutional Committee. Then the turn of the new year, on January 22nd, there'll be a vote by the membership. And then in August 22, we'll actually even see what are some of the rules and how we may be rewriting and will be rewriting rules. And that really runs the gamut of what it could look like. So the possibilities of what comes out of the Constitutional Committee could be more autonomy for those that you hear about, the Power Five and the autonomous group. It could be separate governance for FBS, which is the Football Bowl Series institutions, where again, to the revenue standpoint, where there's a lot of revenue and that makes the spectrum look even more dynamic across from the haves and have-nots. And then also even a reduction of, as I mentioned before, reduction of the role that the NCAA plays. And does that live more at the conference or institutional level because of the way in which we support student athlete experiences and student experiences in higher education? And so that's the NCAA's response and really being intentional as we're living in this inflection point as an association.
Wow, definitely a lot going on. Thank you so much for providing that context. It sounds like name, image, and likeness is just the beginning of a new world in college athletics. So let's turn our attention to NIL. Maisha, what is NIL?
So NIL, by definition, it's the right of publicity. You have the right, essentially, to own your own name, your image, and your likeness. And so, therefore, it can't be used without your commitment. And for an example, you could negotiate a price to have your name, image, and likeness used or not, but there would essentially you have the right for providing that permission. An example would be if Charles Barkley's name, image, and likeness was used for an airline advertisement and he was never given or asked for permission, never granted permission, he could sue for monetary damages in that way. And so because of all that Jill talked about with regard to amateurism, the NCAA made very clear lines about how student athletes could be active in the name, image, and likeness space.
So how did we get to this world where student athletes can profit off of their name, image, and likeness?
Yeah, so I'll take that, Meg. It has been quite a journey. It's been something that's been discussed for years, but really this started when California proposed a state bill called SB 206, Senate Bill 206, came out of California, 2.5 years ago now. And basically they said in that bill, any student athlete in the state of California shall be able to receive money for use of their name, image, and likeness. So they trumped the NCAA rules, if you will. Well, that set off, obviously, a scurry of activity nationwide because from competitive equity purposes, we can't have student athletes in one state being able to make money and in other states not. So if I were a football student athlete, narrowing it down between Ohio State, Florida, and USC, I'd probably lean toward USC, where I can sign a contract with a car dealer, with Nike, with whoever I might want to do. So the California bill is what really started the flurry of activity. And I'm going to slide in an answer to one of the questions we received, because the next step after that bill was for the NCAA to form committees. And so one of the questions we received was, what is our role? So Maisha and I are now both at non-football schools. What role do we have in NCAA governance and what voice do we have? Well, Maisha has been a member of the D1 Council, which is a critical decision-making body in the NCAA. Did I get that right, Maisha?
Formally, yep.
Former member of the D1 Council. Many of you probably know Grace Calhoun, the former athletic director at Penn, chaired the council. So we've got some voice, but I was lucky enough to be named one of 4 athletic directors to the original NCAA committee to review whether or not we should allow student athletes to receive compensation for their NIL. And so that was the ADs from Colorado, Virginia, Ohio State, and St. Joe's. And why St. Joe's? Because I was representing the non-football schools. So the NCAA does make sure that the membership has a voice. So it was first on a committee that reviewed whether or not, as I said, we should allow student athletes to receive compensation for name, image, and likeness. We said yes. And then that moved to the Board of Governors for a vote. And then from there, they formed committees for each division, a little bit like what we're going to do with the Constitution that Maisha just talked about. And then I was appointed along with about 10 other athletic directors to the Division I group that was writing the rules for NIL. So we had a big fancy package of proposals, and those didn't happen because the federal government got involved. So we had all three branches, right? We had the Supreme Court decision in Alston, which clarified some antitrust rules for us. We had the Department of Justice Antitrust Division weigh in on NIL rules and what they should and shouldn't look like. And then, of course, we had Congress busy at work, federal Congress, trying to pass a bill that would provide federal rules for name, image, and likeness. So it wasn't a patchwork of 50 states. That to date has failed. But when all three branches of the federal government got involved, our committee, we sort of voted collectively as a membership not to enact the package. But instead, on July 1, 2021, the NCAA essentially said we're lifting our ban on NIL with only a few restrictions. And so it's wide open unless your state has a law. And we'll get to those restrictions in a little bit. So then on July 1, 2021, Governor Wolf signed into law a Pennsylvania law governing name, image, and likeness. So in addition to the few minor details the NCAA put out in its interim guidance, we're really bound by the Pennsylvania state law effective this past summer. So sorry if that's a little boring, but I think it is important to kind of turn back and look at how we got where we are and really focus in on the fact that primarily we're governed by the state law.
Yeah, so what are some of the opportunities that are now available to student athletes that weren't available before, and what restrictions are there, if any?
Sure. So from an opportunity standpoint, student athletes are now able to advertise and promote commercial entities. What we most hear about is the social media space and student athletes who can serve as influencers to a certain market demographic. And you also hear, so those are individuals with large followings, but then there are very talented individuals who have some notoriety in a marketplace. And so they also are able to advertise, promote, have their name, image, and likeness used, and are making significant income from that. Other opportunities, though, are the things that we used to hear about as being violations. And so now you can actually provide autographs. You can do paid appearances and endorsements and things that are separate from what you're doing as an active student athlete in your particular, at your institution in a competitive event. But these are now things that you can do in addition. And one of the areas that I think we talk about, and it's very appropriate for institutions like ours to be talking about, it's this idea too of being able to leverage your intellectual properties. And so the things that you may be designing as a student in a business school or in an engineering program, but really this idea of being entrepreneur. So now there's this opportunity to be a business owner, to run camps and clinics, and you actually get paid for training someone in a craft that you as a student athlete have obviously elevated to. So that's from the opportunity standpoint, Megan. I'll turn to Jill for the restrictions around it.
Yeah, and that's a great overview, Maisha. And we'll talk a little bit more later about what we're actually seeing on our campuses. But that's a great overview of the possibilities. And I also think, this is a marathon, not a sprint. So a lot of these are going to evolve over time. The restrictions on NIL, as I mentioned, the NCAA didn't say much, but one thing they definitely said, and this goes back, remember the core principle of amateurism is that there's no pay for play. So we can't have Jordan Hall paid for every assist he makes. We can't have a women's soccer player paid. We can't have Kayla Flanders paid for every goal she scores. So pay for play is not okay. Payment from institutions is not okay. And so we're all talking about third parties here. We're talking about student athletes entering the open market. Drexel cannot pay its student athletes, and we cannot pay our student athletes. And why? Because again, that blurs the line between amateurism, employees, et cetera. So that's really, and then the third thing the NCAA said was, this can't be used as recruiting inducements, but that sounds sounds good on the surface, right? Competitive equity. You can't just say, hey, if you come here, we'll hook you up. But what has happened in the open market is that sponsors have been saying every athlete on this team's sport gets the following deal. So it's a bit of a backhanded way. I mean, I think the one deal that might have made the biggest splash, and I'm embarrassed to say I can't remember the name of the company, but it was a local company in Utah who offered every BYU walk-on football player a full tuition scholarship in exchange for advertising, putting that decal on their gear. And so talk about game changer, right? The NCAA limits FBS football scholarships to 85. Well, now BYU, most football rosters are between 115, usually about 115, with 30 people not getting any financial aid. Well, BYU now has 115 on scholarship instead of 85 on scholarship. So, the recruiting inducements, I think, is going to be proved to be the hardest part of this to really contain. Other folks have said every offensive lineman on a football team gets a deal. So I think the line with recruiting inducements has already been significantly blurred. Couple other restrictions that I want to mention. One is state law, and Maisha is going to go into a little bit, I think, later about what exactly Pennsylvania restricts. But the other, and this has proven to be, I think, really problematic, is that our international student athletes are in limbo. We currently have over 30, I think we have 32 international student athletes out of our 487. And the problem there is that they are on F1 student visas, and F1 student visas through the federal government, the Department of Homeland Security, are extraordinarily restrictive on what employment students on F1 visas can hold. And so there is a thought that any kind of accepting of money based on your NIL would be prohibited employment under an F1 visa. So we are awaiting further word from the Department of Homeland Security. But for now, we've had a handful of international student athletes who have had to turn down deals, not clear whether that would jeopardize their visa status, because the consequence if you violate your visa status is you lose your visa and you leave the country. So that's an area that you could, I guess, deem it a restriction. So that's a little bit about, Maisha did a great job of talking about the opportunities, and then those are some of the restrictions.
Yeah, thank you for that overview. As you mentioned, we're going to kind of move over to the state law aspect. So if I understand correctly, PA passed an NIL law effective July 1st, 2021. How does the PA law differ from other states?
Yeah, so when the NCAA policy, and really it's a temporary policy, right? Because I think we're all still holding out hope for some type of uniformity at a federal level, but I do think that in Pennsylvania, from my perspective, and certainly Jill, happy to have you jump in, I think it really helped us to shape exactly what our institutional policy was going to be. We could set some real guidance for our student athletes, as well as what it meant for how student athletes can engage, and then the overlay of our institution, and then certainly the largest overlay of the state law. And so that was really helpful. And so many states have adopted laws, and they do look different. Pennsylvania, where we've gotten pretty clear on expectations, and that's surrounding, we do require, as many states do, to require a disclosure. Pennsylvania requires a 7-day disclosure. So essentially, student athletes have to disclose what the agreement, the arrangement that they're looking to venture into. And then also Pennsylvania has prohibited categories, which I think is, again, has been helpful, just as far as what could be a market where there aren't very clear defining ways in which one can engage. And so some of those prohibited categories are gambling, adult entertainment, alcohol, controlled substances, prescription pharmaceuticals, and tobacco. So similar themes to the things that we obviously have for years talked about as being not permitted in the space. And then the other thing that Pennsylvania, as well as has, that is perhaps unique to some other states, is that student athletes have the right to earn a royalty on any use of their name, image, and likeness on jerseys and video games and trading cards. And that's that's important to note too, because of just historically how we've gotten here, right? The use of name, image, and likeness in whether it was video games and just how, again, student athlete usage in the marketplace, commercial marketplaces.
So now that we're 3.5 months into this new NIL world, what are each of you seeing on your own campuses in terms of NIL activity among your student athletes?
I'll jump in, Maisha. I want to comment just, it's just sort of interesting to think about the state law and the categories that are prohibited. I saw this morning that a football student athlete signed a first big deal with a, shall we say, a birth control related company down in Florida. And so I think, it's interesting. So again, I would love to hear feedback from others. And I ask people at cocktail parties what they think of this, but, we can sell beer in the arena, but a 21-year-old student athlete can't represent a beer distributor. We allow in the state of Pennsylvania sports betting, including technically on the books, the ability to place a prop bet on a student athlete. Now, though they have not accepted any prop bets to date, but that means we have a Pennsylvania state law that says I can place a bet on whether or not Taylor Funk will hit 5 threes in a game, or Katie Jaycott will shoot, perfect from the free throw line, but yet student athletes can't endorse the Hard Rock Cafe because they're affiliated with gambling. So I think there are all sorts of interesting issues associated. I don't have the answers, but just when you were talking about the restrictions, Maisha, it made me think I'd love to get people's opinion on that. But that's not what you asked me. You asked me, what are we seeing? And so what are we seeing? We have well over 30 deals that have been disclosed to us. I am pleased to report that by gender, they are split almost right down the line. And a comment about gender, I mean, to me, people, when we were going through the NCAA committee process, like, oh, this is going to be all football players, this is going to hurt females. Well, even if female athletes don't make the same in an aggregate way as some of the football and other student athletes, female student athletes have very little potential when they graduate because of, frankly, I believe, sexism in our society and the fact that you can, play pro softball, but you basically are paycheck to paycheck. And so for me, for the gymnasts, the softball student athletes, the volleyball, the post-Olympians, I mean, the Olympics were filled with student athletes. I think this is really a good thing for female student athletes. So pleased to see that our gender mix is pretty even. There's a seasonal element to these NIL deals. And so field hockey, shout out to the number 11 field hockey team in the country right now. They're in season and they're good. And so we've got some field hockey student athletes with deals. And so that's a little bit of what we're seeing. It's spread out among sports. I don't think the basketballs have any more by total count than any other sport. So that's all exciting. What are the deals? Is anyone getting rich? The answer to that is no. The deals are predominantly, like Maisha talked about earlier, there are discounts, there's free gear, there's products, there's social media. Companies are basically DMing student athletes and saying, hey, would you be interested in doing a post for $50 a post, or a 50% discount, or if someone uses the promo code, you get a free gear package. That's a lot of what we're seeing across the country. The main attention falls on the $1 million deal for a quarterback, but that's not the norm. So that's a little bit, but that's just what Maisha referred to as the 7-day disclosure for a contract. I do think we're seeing some other fun things that maybe don't even need to be disclosed, depending on how you read the PA state law. So the previous NCAA rules were so restrictive that arguably I couldn't post Jill Bodensteiner, St. Joe's Division I student athlete free throw lessons, because that was using my name, image, and likeness for commercial gain. So I know we've got student athletes selling art on Etsy. I know we've got student athletes advertising lessons. We have student athletes now advertising babysitting. Hey, Division I student athlete, St. Joe's, I'm responsible, time management. I can handle your babysitting. So I think there's there's a whole lot of fun things going on. And I will tell you, we'll talk about this in a little bit too, just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, we're only a few months in. So Maisha, anything I said ring true to you at Drexel?
Yeah, and it's actually good food for thought, even for us to continue this conversation off of here, because it is interesting, the gamut of what you see, and then also what students have access to. Very good point of the fact that now you can say Maisha Palmer, St. Joseph's track and field student athlete, and here's something that I'm offering in the space. Seeing very similar deals. I sort of joke that many of our deals are, free taco and a t-shirt, because it really is, it's the product. It's getting access to a product, typically a local product, and being brand ambassador essentially is what student athletes are serving as. Minimal compensation or some percentage of, or a flat fee. That's really what we're seeing. Similar numbers to what Jill has disclosed in the pieces that I talked about earlier, as far as the entrepreneur business owner. I think that's the space where, because it doesn't fit into an actual executed agreement. And the one thing that we certainly can get into, but because when we go down the pathway of looking at a disclosure, and if a student athlete, and if they ever want to use our marks, as in Drexel's marks, whether they be university or athletics, that's where our policy kicks in. What is sort of their right to do that? And so when we're looking at those kinds of agreements, and that's where we can leverage some ownership and authority on how actually it will represent university or department marks. And so there's a little bit more of a look into. And so some of those have been deals, honestly, that we haven't approved because of that conflict, and what is a conflict of interest for our institution or department.
Maisha, your comments led me to add two things. One, maybe tell our attendees, there's a pretty significant difference in the world of athlete endorsement between individual licenses and group licenses. So what Maisha is referring to, the concept of a group license, a perfect example of that, really two examples that everyone talks about: trading card packs and EA Sports games. So the Madden NFL game, the way that works is EA Sports starts with the NFL. And that's a three-party group license, right? Hey, NFL, do we have right to use your marks and images so we can make it the NFL theme song and all those sort of things? And then they go to the teams. Do we have your right to use your uniforms, your logos, your stadiums? And then they go through the union, the NFL Players Association, and the union, upon signing a contract in the NFL, you become a member of the union. You can opt out. No one does. And then the union has rights to a certain basic group licensing, so that the EA Sports or the trading card pack doesn't have to go athlete to athlete and negotiate those. And so what Maisha is referring to in many ways is sort of a group license, where it would be, hey, student athlete can benefit, but wait a minute, you want to use the flapping hawk and our logos and our uniforms and our colors, those are our institutional marks. And so now we're into at least a three-party agreement rather than an individual license. So I think that's an area that's really, it's been pretty slow to move, but I think because it takes more coordination, I think that's an area. Certainly we're in conversations with a company who negotiates and helps with group licenses. And so I think that's going to be coming down really quickly. You said something else brilliant, but I forget it for now. So I'll circle back. I'm sure I'll remember what it was, but wanted to just make that note about group licenses.
Thank you for that insight. So athletic departments also play an important role, obviously, in the development of student skills in their sport, but also beyond sport in many ways. How are you looking to support your student athletes as they embark on this NIL journey?
Sure, I'm happy to start, because I think for me, this is at the core of why I sit here and, being a product of St. Joe's, because it really is about how you support students holistically through this platform of being able to compete in whatever the sport might be. And so to me, it comes back to education. It's imperative, of course, that we educate along the lines of compliance. And so how to be compliant with certainly what is Pennsylvania law. And so every compliance officer's job at every institution really changed a lot come July, where, trying to define, now we're pulling in law that you really have to pull into the compliance piece. And so making sure that we're educating our student athletes about the laws and the policies that now exist in this space. But then there's that other component, and I actually look at it as the student development space has evolved. It was life skills when I was a student athlete. It's really gone heavy into leadership development. For us, we're taking the approach of now it's developing as entrepreneurs. So what does your brand mean? What does it mean from your simple values and who you align with? And I mentioned earlier, you're known by the company you keep. It's also who you take that lens, you take that approach into an organization that you work with, an organization that you do deals with. And so we're really building out an educational platform where our students can be thinking about, what do they value? What are agreements that make sense for representing their brand, their own name, image, and likeness? What's financial literacy? And financial literacy, not just from the writing checks, but now if you're earning income, what does that mean from a tax perspective? Jill mentioned earlier international student athletes, and that's a whole nother component of education. How can they or can't they operate and engage in this space? And then for Drexel, we're able to partner with our business school and we have an entrepreneurial school and program. And so therefore it's really about, how do you take a skill set? So whether or not you engage in NIL space or not, what are those skills that you need for any industry that you enter to really be able to exhibit your brand and build towards what you want to do professionally or even personally in this space? And so that's the responsibility I think we have, and that's the approach that we're taking given this evolution in NIL.
Great stuff, Maisha. And I will say, just to sort of take it back a step, there was pretty interesting conversation when I was in my committee role on what the role of the institution would be in all of this. And so again, you're trying to do a couple things, balance a couple interests. One, competitive equity. So we envisioned the big schools with lots of money creating NIL departments to negotiate deals. Well, then that becomes obviously a significant recruiting advantage. So, the NCAA, I think as members, we had sort of a vision of what the institutional role would be, and that was spelled out in our draft proposals, but those didn't come to fruition. And I think each state law is a little bit different. The Pennsylvania state law is a little bit vague. It says institutions don't have to arrange deals for student athletes. So I think we're all finding our way on what the appropriate role of the institution is. Same with like vetting agents. PA state law says you have to allow student athletes to have representation, which I think is great. They can get lawyers, financial advisors, agents, etc. But I think our general counsel's on the phone right now. Nobody wants Jill Bodensteiner saying, here's the agent you should use, because then if something goes awry, then I'm on the hook. And so the institutional role is not crystal clear, but one thing is very clear is that we can educate. And that's exactly what Maisha talked about. And so for us, like you nailed it on the head, we're taking the same approach. This is about professional development, not getting rich. This is about building your resume, dipping your toe into the open marketplace, creating your own brand. So we're about to unveil, and people say, well, the law has been effective July 1. Why haven't you unveiled your full program? Well, there are hundreds of vendors in the marketplace trying to come be our friends, and to do our due diligence and make sure that we're not signing up with companies that want to take advantage of student athletes. We've done a little waiting, watching, and listening, and we're about to unveil our program, but I'll give this group a sneak preview. So it's based on 4 tenets. It's comply, advocate, educate, and brand. So the compliance piece is coming up with our policy, reviewing the disclosure forms, making sure our student athletes aren't stepping in it and violating state law. All of those elements, we've been up and running since July. With respect to advocate, I'm working with peers and locals to advocate for international student athletes. If there's a federal NIL bill that comes back, I'm going to try and weasel my way onto any committee. And so advocate and advocacy on behalf of our student athletes is a big piece of our program. And then third, educate. Maisha talked about all the different forms of education. The A10 has partnered with a group called Team Ultimus, and they've got a library of educational videos. Again, I think our general counsel's on the phone. Massive shout out to her. We worked together and created a series of 5 educational briefings. So we have them on Federal Trade Commission rules, because the federal government says if you're endorsing a product, you have to use it. And other little tidbits. And so we've got one on international student athletes. We've got one on copyright issues. We don't want our student athletes using other people's intellectual property inappropriately. We've got probably an 8-pager on developing your own camps and clinics and some of the issues that come up there. And then we've got one on ingestibles, because a lot of what's going on in the market is supplements and other ingestibles. And so if I'm repping Advocare, just a reminder to our student athletes that the FTC says you have to be using Advocare in order to advertise it, but we got to make sure it doesn't have a banned substance under NCAA rules such that you test positive. And so there's, those are the kind of briefs. I think we're going to be posting that series of briefs later today. And so those are some of the things we're doing to educate. And then brand, that's exactly what Maisha, how can we help you build your brand, not just to sell and try and get money or discounts or product, but for your life. And we've got an exciting partnership we're about to announce in the next 2 weeks on the brand front. So those are some of the things that we're doing. Again, we've kind of been baby stepping into this to see what are our students interested in. I had a how to get started in NIL webinar, and we had about 30 people join out of 487. So I don't want to force this down people's throats either. I want to see what our student athletes are interested, what kind of deals they're getting, and then sort of ease into it from there.
Awesome, thank you. Good stuff. So what are your concerns about NIL, if any? Do the new rules change the student athlete experience in any negative kind of way?
Maisha, you want to tackle a few, or you want me to tackle a few?
Sure. I will say for as it relates to NIL, I mean, I really am generally supportive of students being able to engage in this space. I think that it creates a equalizer to their non-student athlete peers. And so it's a real opportunity. I do think that there can be potential depending on the level of activity, the level of compensation, the level of focus or interest in select students on a team. There can be dynamics that present within a team, social dynamics, team dynamics, however you want to call it. I think the biggest piece, and where you can say concern, but I would say opportunity for us and where our responsibility falls is really helping from that educate standpoint. So not the advise that Jill had talked about, we're not advisors, but educating, really having student athletes be thoughtful about how they may engage, how they may go into agreements. What I think is certainly your most prized thing is who you are as an individual. It's important. And so the care in which you handle that, particularly as you're going into, again, representing other entities, or whether it's advertising, promoting, and just those business pieces. And so I think that the concern too, and this is perhaps on for another webinar, but I think it is certainly, it does point and illuminate there is an evolution of what the collegiate model and how student athletes will engage and live in this space, and how we as institutions, regardless of the division, how we support them. And so I think that that's just more to come.
For those of you who are my age or older, I worry about FOMO, the fear of missing out, because our student athletes are already really, really, really stressed and over-programmed in many ways. So, but Maisha, let's talk a little bit more. We've mentioned a few times sort of the risks in this. And I think one of the things, I am certain that somewhere across the country this year, some student athlete's going to sign an agreement and violate that agreement. He or she will not show up for an appearance. He or she will otherwise breach the contract, and then he or she will be sued. for breach of contract. And, some student athlete will be taken advantage of, and some student athlete will sign a 6-year deal, not understanding that their market value could skyrocket in 1 year. Perhaps a gymnast who has a moderate value right now to her NIL, scores a 10 or makes an Olympic team, and she's stuck in a deal back when she was the 3rd best gymnast on the West Virginia team. So I think there are some risks, and that's part of, again, goes back to our education. But one thing about the market is there's like young people way of thinking about the market, and then there's 50-year-old myself way of thinking about the market. So when I hear autographs, I picture me waiting outside of Wrigley Field for Bill Buckner's autograph. There's now online, fully digital autograph market. There's Cameo. We've mentioned a few times camps, clinics, and lessons. I don't know that any student athlete will actually give them in person, because there are 6 platforms you can sign up for and do online lessons. And then you don't have to worry in the same way about insurance. Video games. There's now platforms out there by which I can sign up as an athlete. Let's say I am James Fletcher, our leading scorer on the men's soccer team. James can sign up, and then little kids who he met at camp can pay for an hour of playing FIFA against James. All online. They never meet. I mean, the marketplace is fascinating. And again, part of the reason we're easing into this is I suspect not all of those market players are going to be great deals for our student athletes. And so, a lot of it's just vetting this explosive market in terms of what's out there and helping to protect our student athletes the best we can, while still realizing people wanted the open market. You're going to get the open market, and there's some risks to the open market. Maisha, I don't know about you. I am not creating a staff of NIL. This is going to be handled by our student development, our external staff. We're going to do it by committee. And we simply don't have the time or resources to focus our, 100% of our time helping student athletes get deals. So, I think, and I'm going to respond to some of the questions we got in advance right now. I think that one of the exciting things about this, I do think some student athletes, particularly in quote revenue sports, might stay in school longer. I think one of the reasons many of them left to pursue a pro career was so they could make this sort of income. And so somebody had asked, how will it affect graduation rates? I don't worry as much. I think we have enough academic support and not the size of the deals to worry that our student athletes are going to start skipping class for this. But I do think it might have the other effect where some people stay in school. So I think that's a pro. Already mentioned the gender equity pros. So I think there's so much, it's so new. Again, I'm excited about it and to see what opportunities lie ahead.
Cool. Well, looks like we're doing great on time. So I'm going to pass it to Stacy, who is going to address a question from our audience that they submitted before the webinar.
Thank you, Meg. Jill and Maisha, this has been fantastic information, and we've had a lot of really good questions come in. One question that I've seen come up several times is what impact do you think this will have on scholarships for future athletes? Do you think that there'll be a move towards paying players at some point versus having athletic scholarships like we see now?
So I think that's 2-part. Let's focus on the micro part of it as it relates to NIL. I think the impact it will have not directly on scholarships, but is that recruiting? How is this going to play out in recruiting? So I think that's one piece of what certainly we're tracking with respect to NIL directly. The second answer I would give is the much broader one, and I'm sure what the individual asking the question had in mind. Will this lead to institutions paying student athletes? I would say the most important thing to the member schools of the NCAA is to be really thoughtful about our relationship with students going forward. And so I mentioned at the beginning that there have been all sorts of challenges to people saying we believe student athletes should be considered employees. So do I think that will happen? I'm sure there are a lot of people who wish it would happen and a lot who wish it wouldn't. Do I think it will happen? I don't. I don't believe that that we are going to declare student athletes and start paying them. However, what I do think is going to happen and this Maisha touched on with the NCAA Constitutional Convention. I think what's going to happen is the NCAA is going to have an extremely limited role. As Maisha mentioned, that means pushing governance off to the conferences. And then I think each conference might come up with wildly different ways of treating their student-athlete relationship. And so do I think we could be at a position where some conferences are offering more than a scholarship in some shape or form? Yes, I do think we could get there. So this is why, I mean, I think this is probably the most exciting and interesting time to be in college athletics, because of issues like that, which are absolutely game changing. So I'm pulling out my crystal ball at the very end here, but I think some form of our relationship of student athletes is going to continue to change.
Yeah, I don't know that I have anything more to add to that. I think being clear about separating out NIL and what that means from a student athlete opportunity to engage as an individual to then what we've seen, which I think, Joe, you're right, this is extremely fascinating time for intercollegiate athletics and for fans of and folks paying attention to things that have even come out of Supreme Court decisions and current litigation. I think those will be what ends up shaping what in addition to a scholarship or instead of a scholarship could look like. And so that's I think that's where we're at in the landscape, but staying true to what a student relationship is with an institution is certainly at the core of my interest and where I think the association wants to remain.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more question before we go. Do you see that this will have varying effects on revenue sports versus non-revenue sports in the future?
Is this NIL or are we just talking landscape?
Yeah.
So, well, I think, and I think it will have, I think it can it depends. So from an advertising and promotion standpoint, Joel referenced the quarterbacks from an FBS institution and the degree to which they can make and be compensated because of the notoriety. I think it looks different based on that. And the most, football and basketball, the revenue sports, so to speak, and there are other revenue generating sports depending on your institution and the sport, but I think that they have the most, they are more in the media and more in the marketplace. But I do think to the point of there's opportunity from that influencer space and other avenues of this where I think it can certainly impact non-revenue sports.
I will answer another question in answering that one. So the question is, there are people who say Power 5 football should break away and form its own entities. That's a very similar related question. And to some extent, I mean, the college football playoff governs itself. And so the NCAA runs all championships, March Madness, field hockey, women's rowing, but not the football postseason, right? That all goes through the college football playoff. And so, and the college football playoff folks and the FBS folks aren't sharing their revenue with the rest of us, the way that the NCAA is sharing the annual $1 billion CBS March Madness TV contract with all institutions. Division I, Divisions 2 and 3 also get a piece of that revenue. So again, I'm not sure I can say what I think is best and would that be a viable and a good way. I think we're heading closer and closer to a direction that recognizes that the current governance model is not working and is not sufficient. And so whether that's the 130 FBS schools, actually pulling out and forming their own entity, whether we leave that to conferences, at the core of it is going to be two things that are critical to schools like Drexel, and shout out Maisha to your 4 NCAA teams last year. There are two issues that are really critical in this. One is access to championships, right? We all want to play for the national championship, watching James Madison in softball, watching Delaware win a field hockey national championship. These are not FBS programs. We all want access to championships. We want to have our basketball team in the Sweet 16, both of them. And the second is revenue distribution. How are we going to divide? Does it remain appropriate for football to keep all of their revenue? And should they just peel off from a governance perspective? How are we going to share the March Madness, assuming March Madness remains the way it is, revenue among the institutions? So I really do believe that the access to championships, the revenue distribution, and I'll add a third, which is governance, setting your own rules, enforcement, are the key issues of the Constitutional Convention. And that's why, although it's sliding under the radar, I think that the January vote and the subsequent August of 2022 rules are going to provide greater clarity. And I think it's, again, to quote Mark Emmert, we're not talking about tweaks, we're talking about an overhaul, a transformative overhaul of the NCAA. So I don't have the answers. I have a lot of questions and a lot of thoughts, but this is going to be seismic.
Great,
Fantastic.
thank you for that.
Thank you. So to conclude today's webinar, let's wrap up with one more poll that will pop up on your screen momentarily. As you respond to the poll, I'd just like to open it up to each of you to share any closing comments, or maybe reflect on what we might see over the next few years. I know you kind of touched on it, but any final thoughts or any closing thoughts? Jill, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I got a little ahead of myself. I told you about the new role of the NCAA. I am optimistic that there will be a federal bill. And so the question becomes, so right now there have been bills proposed by Republicans in Congress and by Democrats in Congress, and right now they're pretty far apart. And so I do believe there will be a compromise bill. And what would that federal bill do? It would maybe say, hey, states, we're preempting your NIL laws so that there's one NIL law instead of 50. It would possibly say, we believe that student athletes are not employees under any federal law. It would possibly address antitrust and how it applies to the NCAA. So those are a couple of the things. And then along with this notion that both Maisha and I have talked about of, power maybe going from NCAA to conferences, and we've already started to see it, is conference realignment. And so schools are scrambling to put themselves in the best possible position if the conferences are in control, to put themselves in the best conference. So the SEC started it by stealing Texas and Oklahoma. The Big 12 in turn stole from the American Conference, and the dominoes continue to fall. So I think we're seeing in earnest wave 2 of significant conference realignment as a result of all this disruption that we've talked about in the past hour. And then the final thing I'll say is I think the NIL is going to continue to grow and grow. And I think it's exciting. I'm excited to see where it goes and what opportunities it offers to our student athletes.
Definitely. Maisha, is there anything that you'd like to leave our audience with?
No, I think Jill hit it on the nail on the head. I will say that the one thing I'll just expand a bit on is the conference realignment conversation, is that what I do think it helps, at least certainly in my opinion, in the conversations that I'm in, is it really helps us ensure that we're having those conversations that we're educating our student athletes about, right? What do we value? What is our brand? Who do we want to align with? And how do we stay true to that? And I think that that is just a critical and important exercise. I know, again, I'm in this industry because of what my experience was over 20 years ago. And so staying true to that is really important. So I look forward to being a part of what is this evolution, but also being one of those that's keeping my feet rooted in the reason why, again, we sit here.
Yeah, great. Awesome. Well, before we go, let's see those poll results. Should pop back up. All right. Very optimistic. We love to see it.
I'm
great.
Surprised.
Yeah. So as we close today's session, I'd like to remind you that a recording of this webinar will be made available at sju.edu/unlimited learning. I'd like to thank Jill and Maisha again for lending your time and expertise to today's conversation. Thank you to St. Joseph's University for hosting this event. And thank you all for your time, attention, and participation. Also, stay tuned for the announcement of our next installment of the Unlimited Learning series. More information will be shared soon on sju.edu/unlimited learning. Again, I'm Meg, class of 2016. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Meg.
Thanks, Maisha. Thanks, Meg.
Thanks, Jill.